Welcome to the Communication is Key training module. We will cover 4 objectives throughout this module. The first objective is, what can you do? Effective strategies to communicate with individuals with disabilities. The second objective is, what you can expect. Ways that individuals with disabilities can communicate with you. The third objective is how-tos. Ways to talk and write about disability. And the fourth objective is tips and tricks. Increase your communication efficacy in the workplace. Let's discuss Objective 1, what you can do, effective strategies to communicate with individuals with disabilities. These are some things that you can do during a conversation with an individual with a disability that will help you communicate more effectively. You will want to speak directly to the individual, avoid interrupting them, use active listening skills, use age-appropriate language, avoid making assumptions, and ask questions. We will now go into each of these recommendations in more detail. When engaging an individual with a disability in a conversation, it is important to look directly at them and speak to them, rather than any aide, family member, or individual who is with them. This is important so that the individual knows you are speaking directly to them and want to hear what they have to say. Individuals with disabilities may have difficulty responding to you during a conversation. If this is the case, you should be patient and wait for them to finish speaking instead of interrupting or trying to guess what they are going to say. Wait for the individual to indicate to you that they would like help finishing their thought before jumping in. No one likes to be interrupted when speaking, and by allowing the individual to finish speaking on their own, you are working towards establishing a trusting and caring relationship with them. It is also important to use active listening skills during all conversations, especially if someone is having difficulties trying to communicate with you. Repeating phrases is a good way to show you are listening and confirm what they said. Keep eye contact the whole time and present yourself with welcoming body language. It is also very important that if you don't understand what the person has said to you, don't pretend to understand and move on from the conversation. Ask questions so that you know what they are trying to tell you. Another important thing to remember when talking to individuals, specifically young adults with disabilities, is to treat them and speak to them like adults. Sometimes, people have a tendency to speak to teens and young adults with disabilities as if they are still children, assuming that their intelligence is lesser than their peers. Individuals with disabilities are consistently denied experiences of their peers in the same life stages, and by talking with them at the level we would with their peers, we can help be a part of a solution rather than the problem. You should not make assumptions about people that you meet and speak with, regardless of if they have a disability or not. Everyone, including those with disabilities, is different and thinks, acts, speaks, and navigates the world in many different ways. The term disability is broad and encompasses a vast number of different diagnoses and conditions. A popular saying goes, if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. If your neighbor is a person with autism, don't assume that the cashier at the local grocery store who has autism is similar to your neighbor. Treat every individual with a disability that you are meeting and communicating with for the first time as a brand new person. The more you talk to them, the more you will learn about them. Only they can be experts on themselves, and the only way you can learn about them is by asking. This leads us into our next recommendation. When you are communicating with an individual with a disability, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you are unsure about how you can better communicate, ask them. If you don't understand what they are trying to tell you, ask them for clarification. The more you communicate and the more questions you ask, the more effort you are putting into your relationship with this person, which is a great way to build a strong line of communication in the workplace. Now we'll move on to our next objective, which is understanding how an individual with a disability may interact and communicate with you. Again, it is important to remember that these are guidelines of what to expect, but every individual is different and may have different methods of communication that work best for them. There are many different ways that people can communicate with each other. We will go over how individuals with disabilities may communicate with you through verbal and nonverbal methods. We will also talk about how speaking and understanding a conversation can look with individuals with disabilities. Every individual with a disability is different and has different communication methods. Often, individuals with disabilities will use a form of verbal communication. whether that be making sounds, speaking in words and/or sentences. Some may use assistive devices to help them communicate as well. These devices often are set up to produce words that can be heard out loud as a result of the individual hitting a switch or button. It is important to not assume the complexity or lack thereof of an individual's verbal communication. The best way to learn about an individual's verbal communication is through having conversations with them and again, asking questions. Everyone, including individuals with disabilities, uses forms of nonverbal communication, such as body language, facial expressions, and gestures. You can learn so much from body language during a conversation. Paying attention to these signs can help you decipher what someone is trying to communicate to you if you can't initially understand from their spoken language. Another form of communication that is nonverbal is sign language, or in the United States, American Sign Language. Sometimes, individuals with disabilities who have difficulties with speaking may communicate through signing. It is helpful to learn basic signs so you can increase your ability to understand people who can't always communicate through speaking. When an individual with a disability is speaking, there may be actions that cause their message to be misinterpreted. The following are examples of what speaking may look like, covering a range of options. The intention here is to provide us with knowledge that can help ease any miscommunication that may occur. In terms of what is being said, individuals with disabilities may be able to communicate in full sentences with multiple or single words with an iPad or other communication device. They may not follow conventional conversation rules like taking turns while talking. They may be off-topic or hyper-fixated on special interest topics during a conversation. They may also have difficulty retelling a story or including important details to get the intended message across. They may also have difficulty asking questions or only ask a limited number of questions. In terms of speech patterns, there may be a wide variation. Individuals may speak quickly or slowly. They may have a flat affect and may not seem interested in the conversation, or they may be very animated and excited. They may speak loudly or quietly. They may not use typical grammar structures when speaking, such as not adding a verb tense, jump instead of jumped, or may not speak using plurals, door versus doors. Once again, these are options that might describe the speech of an individual with a disability. An individual may also have no difficulty speaking. It is highly important to not make assumptions with this knowledge, but use it to better be prepared to engage in meaningful conversations. Some individuals with disabilities may have difficulties with the comprehension aspect of a conversation, like understanding what is being said to them. Similar to speaking difficulties, not all individuals with disabilities will have comprehension difficulties. These are a range of more common comprehension difficulties that an individual with a disability may experience. In terms of following, some individuals may have difficulty following multi-step directions. They may have difficulty sequencing tasks and/or figuring out the order to complete tasks in. They may need directions presented to them in another form to better understand them, such as printed words or with pictures. They may have trouble processing information if a lot is presented at once. In terms of regular conversation, individuals with disabilities may have difficulty perceiving sarcasm and/or figurative language such as metaphors. They may have difficulty with understanding different prepositions. For example, on could be interpreted as in, and then the meaning of what you said would get mixed up. They also may have difficulty understanding and answering certain questions such as yes, no, or what, where, when, and why. Once again, these are options that might describe the comprehension of an individual with a disability. An individual may also have no difficulties with comprehending speech. It is important to not make assumptions with this knowledge, but use it to be better prepared to engage in meaningful conversations. Our next objective is to discuss how to talk about disability in general. We will go over some helpful guidelines that can help your business become an inclusive place for individuals with disabilities. There are 6 recommendations we will go over for how to talk and write about disability. They are person-first versus identity-first language, avoiding euphemisms, using neutral terms, avoiding comparisons to individuals without disabilities, not falling into the inspiration trap, and not viewing disability as an illness. When referring to a person with a disability, it is generally appropriate to use person-first language. Examples of person-first language would be an individual with autism or person with diabetes. This phrasing highlights that the disability is not the individual's entire identity, but rather a part of it. However, there are some individuals with disabilities who prefer identity-first language. Examples of identity-first language are autistic individual or diabetic. Some people prefer this language because they feel that it isn't realistic for them to ignore the influence that their disability has on most aspects of their life. It is important to talk with each individual and ask about the type of language they prefer, but as a rule of thumb, it is best to use person-first language when talking about or writing about disabilities. Euphemisms are terms that are a softer version of a word or phrase. They are used instead of using a more direct term or phrase because it may have a negative connotation. An example of this is the phrase putting down a pet instead of saying euthanizing. Euphemisms should not be used when talking about disabilities because you could be implying that the disability is something negative. Common examples are using phrases like challenged, differently abled, special needs, all abilities, and handicapped. It is important to follow this recommendation in order to create an inclusive environment for individuals with disabilities in the workplace and beyond. When talking or writing about disability, it is important to use neutral over negative terms. This is done to avoid presenting disability in a negative light. Some examples of how to not use negative terms when describing disability are as follows. Use phrases like burn survivor instead of burn victim, brain injury instead of brain damaged, and congenital disability instead of birth defect. A simple act, such as changing the words and phrases that we use to describe disability, can promote a more inclusive environment for everyone. It is important to avoid comparisons that paint individuals without disabilities in a better light than those with disabilities. When talking or writing about someone without a disability, don't use words like healthy, normal, or able-bodied. Instead, use phrases such as person without disabilities, typically developing person, and neurotypical. This language gets rid of any negative connotation placed on having a disability and is important to use to promote an inclusive space for individuals with disabilities. It is not uncommon to hear about individuals with disabilities being viewed as inspirations for completing things that they need, want, and have to do. The ideology is similar to, if a person can do XYZ with a disability, then certainly I can do it too. This type of language is problematic because it is the systems that society has in place that make completing these tasks challenging for individuals with disabilities. These quotes from disability activists put this concept into words quite well. Ableism looks like calling disabled people inspiring for navigating a system that is designed for their exclusion while doing nothing to hold the system accountable. And so often they'll call us inspirational, superhuman, rather than help fight the inaccessibility and ableism that makes us have to be so. Unfortunately, disability is often linked to and talked about in the same context as illness. An illness is something that needs to be fixed in order for the affected individual to return to a previous level of functioning. A disability, however, is not something that needs to or can be fixed in order for the individual to function within their environment. The main reason why many people with disabilities have difficulty navigating the world is because of the way our society is set up. It is important to not view disability as an illness or talk or write about it as an illness. Instead, it is important to advocate for the community in your daily conversations about disability. Our next and last objective is going over tips and tricks that can increase your communication efficacy when speaking with individuals with disabilities, specifically in the workplace. Setting clear expectations is helpful in most aspects of life and can be transferred to the context of communicating with an individual with a disability in the workplace. From the start of the experience, you will want to make it clear to the individual what will be expected from them. This can be in multiple forms, such as through verbal communication and writing. Also, as we have discussed throughout this module, each individual is different and might require different expectations to be set in order for them to be their most successful. Get to know the individuals, see what their strengths are and where they can improve, and go from there when setting expectations. As the experience progresses, individuals may gain skills and need new expectations to be set for them, or they may demonstrate that they need more assistance than originally thought, and expectations may need to be modified. This is a learning process, so don't be afraid to work closely with the individuals to find what works best for you and them. Another tip for communicating with individuals with disabilities in the workplace is to utilize different learning methods if your original form of communication is not being understood. People respond better to some learning methods than others, and may even fare well with combinations of them. If someone is a visual learner, they might be better able to understand directions if they are accompanied by pictures reminding them of what they are to do next. Demonstrations of tasks may also be effective for the visual learner as well. For individuals who are auditory learners, they may benefit from repetition of verbal directions, rephrasing how you present the directions by choosing different words, or by creating a rhyming system to help the directions of tasks stick with them better. Tactile learners tend to work best when they can get their hands involved while learning. This could look like guided demonstrations, using hands-on learning methods, and even incorporating a variety of different textured surfaces as cues for what to do next. An example of this would be a piece of scratchy sandpaper to remind someone that they need to sand pieces of wood as their next task. As we discussed previously during the What You Can Expect objective, sometimes individuals may be hyper-focused on certain topics and have a desire to talk about them over appropriate work-related topics. Here are some tips to help bring the individual back to the task at hand if they get off topic too frequently. The first thing you can do is acknowledge that they are trying to talk with you about a certain topic by responding to them in a short statement. For example, if an individual is talking to you about outer space when they are supposed to be helping their coworker restock paper products, you can say something along the lines of, "I like that you are so interested in outer space. It sounds very cool." The next thing you'll want to do is reorient them or bring their attention back to the task at hand. The next thing you could say is, "Maybe we can talk about that another time when we aren't at work. Right now, we are stocking paper products." If the individual is still talking about outer space instead of completing their task, you can reinforce your acknowledgement and reorientation to the task at hand in a shorter version, such as, "I know you love outer space, but right now we are working on stacking paper products." You may have to repeat this reinforcing sentence a few times to help the individual become focused on the workplace task. It is also likely that you may not have this experience at all. Once again, it is important to remember that everyone with a disability is different and communicates in different ways. The last and possibly most important tip for communicating with individuals with disabilities is to not make assumptions about the individual. This is a common theme throughout the module and the training program as a whole, but important enough to highlight once again. Before you meet an individual with a disability, remember that everyone is different. Don't limit the person before getting to know them by what you think they may or may not be able to do. If you think that you are not communicating in the best way possible, ask. You may find out a way to modify your communication style that the person will respond to better. Again, you'll never know unless you break free from assumptions and just ask. Even after meeting and communicating with someone for a while, it is important to still not make assumptions about them. People can exhibit different behaviors, moods, and communication styles day to day. How someone interacts with you one day might not be the same as how they will the next. You've made it to the end of the Communication is Key module. Let's review before you move on to the next. First, you learned what you can do to effectively communicate with individuals with disabilities. Next, you learned ways that individuals may communicate with you during a conversation. Then you learned how to talk and write about disability to promote an inclusive space. Lastly, you learned tips and tricks to increase the efficacy of your communication with individuals with disabilities in the workplace. Thank you for completing the Communication is Key training module. You are now ready to move on to the Maximizing Skill Sets module. If you want to learn more about the modules, the F.O.R.E.S.T program, or view additional resources, visit our website.